Konnichiwa, Samurai James here. In today's video, we're going to take a look at analyzing the Ronin Warriors armor and weapons for historical accuracy. Ronin Warriors is an anime series that aired in 1989 and 90 in Japan and came to the US here in 1995. Given that it's an anime series, of course, there's a lot of fantasy aspects to it, and I understand that, but it's about samurai, it's about weapons, about armor, so I'm going to draw some parallels to the realistic stuff. Now, if you're not familiar with Ronin Warriors, there's a link to my video below that covers the general concept of what it's about, who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, so take a look at those links below. The armor that they wear in the show is very much fantasy armor, but there's a few bits and pieces that are actually based on some historical things. Both Sage and Rowen have very large shoulder guards, and in the days of the samurai, they actually started off with large shoulder guards like this before they became smaller. Sage wields a nodachi, which is a large two-handed sword, and Rowen has a bow, which is also an early period samurai weapon. Over time, the swords got a little bit shorter, so nodachis went out of favor and katana became one of the primary types of swords, and the bow was eventually replaced by firearms. So seeing those two guys with a larger shoulder armor, whereas the rest of the Ronin Warriors have smaller shoulder armor, along with the earlier period weapons, that's just a little bit of a nod to the evolution of the weapons and armor of the samurai. One of the most famous swordsmen in Japan was Miyamoto Musashi, and he was well known for fighting with two swords. He is a later period samurai, just like Ryo wears later period weapons and has smaller shoulder guards than Sage and Rowen do. In the earlier days, if a samurai was going to be fighting with two weapons, the paired long and short swords would actually be a tachi and a tanto, which is a sword bigger than a katana, but not as big as a nodachi, and a tanto is a dagger. Sai wields a three-bladed spear. It looks a little bit like a trident to those in the West. Now, a common yari would have a single straight blade just like this. The three-prong style came over somewhere around the 14th century from China. And since that's one of the later periods of the samurai, and Sai also has smaller shoulder armor, this also fits. Kento has the smaller shoulders as well as the little spikes coming out of them, but this is a little bit harder to pin down for a rough time frame because his weapon isn't based on any actual historical weapon, whereas there was a type of yari with three blades called a Jumanji yari that could be roughly related to Sai's. Historically, they didn't have, the pincher effect where they could close and catch things, but there was a three-bladed spear, there was a nodachi, there's of course the classic Yumi bow, there's katana, so all of those have a normal parallel to something in the real world. Kento's weapon is kind of a mix of a few things. It's partially, when he stretches it out, a three-section staff, which is similar to nunchucks, but it would have three sections to it, and each of these sections would be a bit longer, so he can stretch that out into an actual staff. This is a real weapon that they had. I don't have one of those three-section staffs, but I'm going to throw a picture of it up here. One of the other things that his weapon is partially based on is this monster right here. This is a kanabo. This was your anti-armor weapon for the samurai. Now this one is wood and it's got studs in it here. They also had iron ones that were solid steel. Those were called tetsubo. Bo meaning stick, tetsu being iron. Kanabo is the wooden version of it. So when we see him, whacking at things like that, that's very reminiscent of something like a kanabo. And yet another weapon that Kento's is partially based on, we can see the blade on the end of his polearm. And this is a historical weapon called a naginata, which, as you can see, has a single-edged blade similar to a sword. So think of this as a shorter sword blade on the end of a stick, and this is part of what Kento's weapon is also based on. And at the bottom of Kento's weapon, we can see a few claws. This is similar to a Japanese weapon called the sodegarami, which was the man-catcher. It's a weapon designed to essentially grab into and control an opponent. Or, if things got really ugly, then the opponent's horse. I'm going to throw a picture of it up here since I don't have one to actually show you, but the prongs on the end are very similar to that. Now that's what they wore and what they fought with in the TV series, but we've got some printed material that shows them in different types of armor along with different weapons. Some of this looks really historical, and I've got two of those pictures that I'm going to cover right now. For this first image, Ryo, Sage, Sai, and Rowen all have very classic styles of the samurai armor. They have their own distinct colors in the lacing, and it's really nicely done, down to the little bands of leather at the top of the shoulders and the decorative tassels too. Ryo even has the little flaps that protect the shoulder straps. That's also a historical small piece of armor that we don't see that often, called a gyoyo. It's an evolution of something called the Sendan no Ita and the Kyubi no Ita in the earlier armors that's made to protect the shoulder straps on the armor. Now, as far as the leather bands and the decorative tassels, we can see right here on my own armor, here's the leather banding at the top. The decorative tassels, you can see part of it tied off here. The tassel itself is actually behind the armor in my case. However, I don't have the shoulder strap protectors for mine yet. Now, another really nice detail that we see in that image too is with these shoulder pieces, Ryo is a swordsman and he has his a little bit more forwards to cover his arms better. However, Rowen has them pushed back to sit behind his shoulders, and that's great when you're doing something like firing a bow because it gets it out of the way and it helps protect your back and keep all of that covered. Now, Kento's a little bit of a wild card here. While his body armor looks like the lower end Japanese style, the shoulders are just kind of strange and he's lacking any other types of armor. Since he's a Chinese one in the group, then that might be why it doesn't match the rest of the armors. It doesn't really appear to be a Chinese style of armor either, although I'm not overly familiar with what the Chinese armor types look like aside from the early types. The early types of Chinese armor are what came to Japan, and Japanese armor was before the time of the samurai when it began to get its own distinct style. And this doesn't match what the early Chinese armor looks like, so it may be simply a way to show that he was the Chinese origin one in the group. I'm not really sure on that one, but for some reason they didn't give him armor matching the rest. This one's another neat one. They're all wearing classic samurai style armor that has all the beautiful lacing, just like you saw in my own armor a moment ago. The style that Ryo is wearing is something called an oyuroi. That's an older style of armor, and this one is actually correct. Even though it doesn't match the others, it is an actual historical style of armor as well. Now, for Ryo's armor, the breastplate, we can actually see the two shoulder strap protectors that I mentioned earlier on. This is the same thing that we saw from the earlier picture, but the older style. Now, the strange thing here is that Rowen has a fully laced body, whereas Ryo seems to have this single-piece breastplate. Historically, with the oyuroi, which is the great armor, this would be the same lamellar style as the rest of the armors that you see in the picture, but that piece there is not a single sheet of steel. It's actually a piece of leather that's attached over the top. And what this leather was designed to do was to prevent the bowstrings from catching on the scales and the lacing underneath. A little bit out of place for Ryo to have it since he's not the archer in the group, but still, it is a historical style, and it's really cool to see that. You'll notice the other guys have the skirt armor, which is the kusazuri. Theirs is different from Ryo's. In Ryo's case, it's actually 4 panels, which are split down towards the bottom into halves. That's also correct for the oyuroi armor historically, which is a nice little feature to see. Sage is notably missing his trademark nodachi, and we see him wearing what seems to be some sort of a vest. That's called a jinbori, which is a historical jacket that higher-ranking samurai would wear to show their rank and their status. Once again, poor Kento has less armor than the rest of the guys, and it just doesn't seem to be as impressive, which is a shame because I really like Kento. He's just kind of in the back stretching. He doesn't seem to have any visible weapon, and given the lack of a weapon, I'm sure that his current focus right now is trying to find out what he's going to eat. At least this time his armor is more Japanese style to match the rest of the guys. It's not quite so different than it was in the first picture. Now Sai has a yari here, which is a spear. That was one of the classic battlefield weapons early on. A lot of people think that the sword was the primary weapon of the battlefield, but it simply wasn't. It was a fallback weapon. A yari would have been preferable as their first weapon, just like the bow was during the times that they were mounted archers. And in this case, he's got a straight-bladed single spear. Rowen's an interesting one here because he has a bow and a visible quiver of arrows on his back, but he's also got a dagger on his belt, a tanto, and what looks like it could either be a wakizashi, which would be a shorter sword, or just one of the regular katanas. And I think this is a pretty cool detail here because an archer without arrows isn't much of a threat, so it's nice that they gave him a proper set of backup weapons. Now my thanks to Don Sonata for providing these pictures to me. I really enjoyed getting a hold of them and being able to do the analysis on them. And just how close to realistic does this armor look? Well, did you notice in the thumbnail on the video here when you clicked on it that it has this second picture that I did the analysis on, but it's actually got me standing off on the right hand side in my actual armor photoshopped into it? If that didn't jump right out at you, that's a pretty cool little clue there. I mean, this is a suit of armor based on a 16th century suit that's over in a museum in Tokyo. So this is real armor, and if you didn't notice me standing next to the guys there as jumping out too much, that's just a further nod to how well they did with it. Alright, that wraps up my analysis of the Ronin Warriors. I've also got a video for the 4 Dark Warlords and Talpa, so if you want to take a look at that one, click the link. And until next time, this is Samurai James, and thanks for watching, and sayonara.